Hello everybody, welcome to today's Firstbeat webinar that discusses heart rate variability, inflammation, nutrition and lifestyle from different perspectives. We are broadcasting today from Finland with our guest speaker Alessandro Ferretti joining us from London and participants listening in from around the world. My name is Tiina Hoffman, I'm an exercise physiologist and wellness specialist at Firstbeat, working closely together with Firstbeat's international lifestyle partners in different countries. I'll be hosting today's session. Just a reminder, if you want to learn more about the lifestyle assessment method itself, what it is and how it's technically done, please listen to the Introduction to Lifestyle Assessment webinar podcast that you can find on our website. We will also repeat the introduction topic next year with some updated facts and numbers. You can ask questions during the webinar by writing them in the chat window. We will read them out and discuss them at the end of the session. If we don't have time to answer all the questions, we will send the answers to you via email afterwards. And now I would like to introduce today's guest speaker, Mr. Alessandro Ferretti, who is a nutrition specialist and medical director at Equilibria Health and Senses Health. In his work, Mr. Alex focuses on mentoring people, researching nutrigenomics and ketogenic clinical application, and lecturing across the UK and US. He has experience in corporate sector and has helped clients to reach their optimal health and performance. His specialization areas include nutrition, health, sport and psycho-emotional well-being and performance. Welcome, Alessandro. The stage is all yours.
Thank you very much, Tina. I really appreciate your intro and thank you for having me. And I always love to share my findings and research. So let's proceed straight away. Little bit about me. At the age of 6, I was told by a doctor in the presence of my dad that I wouldn't be able to practice any sport. And that in a way triggered my interest in monitoring things, like tracking things and see what happens. So quite a mechanical brain. I kind of disregarded what the doctor said, and my dad put me in a dojo, in a judo center, and sent me to a ski uni. Then I started cycling from the age of 11, and then moving on to triathlon, and in recent years, karate. My main area right now is clinical application in ketogenic diet, but clinical applications and research. So I lecture across US and the UK for the vast majority of my time. So I classify myself a bit more of a researcher. This is my disclosure, just making sure that people understand that I don't sell anything. I don't sell tests, I don't sell vitamins, I don't sell nothing at all. So I have, I'm just here because I was invited, basically. So now, these are my sport, which is a very different set from what the doctor actually told me at the time. So this is me with my son in the judo center, and then top and bottom center is my karate movements, and that is my cycle that, I relax while cycling, considering the other two sports. And the reason why I have found heart rate variability exceptionally useful, especially the ongoing 24-hour measurement type of approach, is because that is where I'm from. And I started to realize that when moving into a city, my body didn't do very well, but didn't quite know what I could possibly do in order to understand. Yeah, we can measure certain markers, but I didn't have a direct insight on what are the things that potentially affect me. So these are my likes, these are my interests, and reasonably, I always try to make sure that I spend some time of the year in a blue zone country. So, where people live the longest and the longevest, like fun. In all these occasions, I could see that I tend to do very, very well. And this is actually where I live. And I live in this place. I live actually in Stratford-upon-Avon, in the Cotswolds area, which is, well, you see the pictures. And the reason why we selected this location for our family was because my body and their body didn't really, whenever I was in a city, even though I was doing exactly the same things, my body, one, did not recover as fast, or two, there were potential inhibitions to my health. So what we're going to see today is an explanation on how we use heart rate variability, not only in clinic, but perhaps to have a better understanding on our patient and an insight in what this patient can actually do and achieve. We're going to look at application. I'm going to show you also a little toolkit that I have used in my research project. Also, we look at a case study, a real application, and also the findings that I had throughout my research. So if you're listening to this webinar, I do assume, hoping I'm assuming okay, that we know what heart rate variability is. So we know that the heart rate doesn't have certain rhythms. It tends to obviously increase as you breathe in and decrease as you breathe out. And if we were to draw an average, even maintaining breathing constant, we know that a heart that has larger gaps with a higher variability of the beats normally is a reflection that the heart is not as stressed, and so is the individual. So I won't go into sympathetic and parasympathetic activation, but it also can be a reflection of inflammatory responses, as we'll see. We have data here looking at untrained individual in this peak here. We look at trained individuals, still recreational, and then we look at athletes. So we can actually see that the root mean square of the standard deviation can be transported to heart rate variability. Just that variable can provide us with a little insight. Now, interestingly enough, either athletes that are overtrained or people that are highly stressed out tends to dramatically drop and quite substantially their heart rate variability. So this can be used as a method for perhaps give us an understanding of sympathetic activation and at the same time potential inflammatory response. Regardless, may not be as distinguishable at first sight as between the two. So looking at the case studies, well, first of all, I tend to look at the individual all the time. Test results are fantastic, but I always try to make them personal. I do not have a fixed recommendation, especially nowadays we're in a world where there is a lot of bogus science, where people say certain things like, this diet works because if you take someone on a Western diet, on a typical average Western diet, and you apply this diet, then the person improves. Well, I have put people on this, and I have part of the research project in that. Any diet that is reasonably healthy will have a positive impact on someone that is on a typical average Western diet. So what we would actually have to take into consideration is how people deal with different diets, both coming from a Western type, but the differences from the application. So for example, someone coming from a normal Western type of dietary approach, we should try, first of all, I don't know, vegetarian or vegan or paleo or ketogenic, and then compare all of them. This is something I often find, especially in research. They do only one comparison, but they don't compare different therapies. So we also tend to look at mental, physical, and physiological aspect, looking at habits and rest and sleep patterns. So the time and point in which the training becomes overtraining, where healthy stimuli normally needed for redox operations in our body becomes stressful, is really hard to judge. So what I started to notice is as soon as I started to be interested in monitoring data and I came across HRV, I started to find measurements with HRV particularly useful because easy accessible. And depending upon the type of measurement we'll see in a minute, we can understand either a baseline or exactly what in the environment can affect, giving a balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So regular checks on an ongoing basis and or 24 hours monitoring. So this will lead us to either a sympathetic activation reflection or an inflammation redox reflection. So we look at, this is typical for fitness, but this could actually fit even people with a high life load. High life load for me means the sum of good stress, also known as eustress, or the negative stress, also known as the distress. And we can apply this graph pretty much to both categories, even in illnesses. So we have a healthy challenge, the body reacts and recover, and then eventually we have what normally people would refer to overtraining, but I prefer to call it under recovery. Just being petty, most of the times it's not just overtraining, but is the lack of recovery, as we will see later. So we can track data through, bloods, urine sample, salivary sample, but the access that we have through heart rate variability, I think, is great because it's reasonably non-invasive. So we know that the body produces free radicals, and a certain amount of free radicals are actually beneficial to support a redox balance. So a certain amount of stress will make the body grow stronger, will make the body recover more, will make the body try to improve. And oxidative stress, if in excess, can generate inflammatory response. Regarding inflammation, when is it useful and when is it not useful? In the way how I see that is, and also consulting with my colleagues, we tend to look at if the inflammation tends to modulate or regrow, repair tissue, then we consider that as a healthy inflammatory response. So in that case, we would try to support. So we wouldn't want to dampen fully that inflammation unless potentially start to be erratic and or detrimental through attacking healthy tissues, in which case we definitely would prefer to have a damping effect either through natural ways or supplementation or perhaps even medication in some cases. So this is my toolkit, and since the introduction and my first use of the Bodycard 2 from Firstbeat, things have gone remarkably easier. So I in my research projects, I measure glucose, ketones, if applicable, heart rate variability and heart rate. I also measure other, the frequencies as well, and also sleep. In addition to that, I also have a questionnaire where you can highlight a self-reported perception of the load that people would have, also cross-referencing that with the number of hours that they work at high intensity. So how do I use HRV? Well, at the start, I wasn't aware of Firstbeat, so I used the snapshot type of effect. So this is really a baseline that we can create. So first thing in the morning, as soon as we wake up, we take a measurement between 60 and 180 seconds, and we get a baseline. Whereas the one that I tend to most of the times prefer is obviously the ongoing 24 hours times 2 to 3 days, because that can give me a very precise idea in clinical application on what are the things that can impact in the person's environment. So with a snapshot, yes, we can mine some data, but are not as easily distinguishable between one thing and another. So if you can actually see, this is a snapshot of me. This is me whilst lecturing. So if you actually look at this area here, that is me lecturing. You can see the 4 blocks, and I never thought that lecturing is actually stressful on the body. I lecture about what I love. I present my research. There is very little ego behind that, and it for me is something natural to do. But my body perceives that as a mild, low intensity stress activation. So it's something obviously to take into account. And particularly if we look at the spread over a few days, that was me lecturing in the US, and you can actually see that regardless, I was really focusing on how I was recovered. So I was really aware of my recovery, making sure that there wasn't much alcohol, and making sure that the sleep was good. I still managed to substantially decrease my resilience. For me, that is resilience. So how strong is the body? In addition to that, I love this area. This was me doing a simple, quite low session. Well, it's actually for me it's very low because my sports are, karate and judo and are pretty anaerobic, and that would be for me a very light session. So we can get a lot of insight through that. And you can see that the snapshot gives you some data. This is, a really simple. There is a correlation, but this is very hard to mine any data to tell me what in specific is affecting me, my patient, my clients, and etc. So the case study I wanted to bring you was one because I was a bit puzzled with the study. So most of the times we have patients that they come in and they have all sort of diseases and all sort of major problems. This is a 50-year-old female on a very healthy lifestyle and a really good diet, main physical activity, yoga, lots of walks, lots of awareness around health. And she's very busy. She's running a couple of companies, but according to her, she had a good understanding of life-work-load balance and no real symptoms. It's kind of one of these patients you think, why are you coming to see me? Maybe I should learn something from you. So I went through with a couple of things, but what we started to do during the 24 hours monitoring, we started to realize that when she was eating, especially around lunchtime, her postprandial data and periprandial, so basically when she was eating and after eating, as you can see from the circle here, her variables dramatically changed. And this was all healthy food. She cooked her food, it's all organic. So all things that you think, right, okay, how is it possible? And the food was also very simple, not very complex. And what we were able to notice is that also when she thought that she was just enjoying her time and going shopping, for example, actually she wasn't. She was actually quite sympathetically activated. So if I go shopping, I'll be a disaster for sure. So and one of the things that we looked at was we started to modify the diet, but also modify the resting period in order to bring a lot more meaningful. As you can see, the second one here is much lower than the very first one. Something that in her eyes, she was actually doing. In addition to that, we added one strong session a week in order to try to support her healing part and her susceptibility to changes. So what we did, and this I'm presenting something of my research project, we started to look at ketogenic application. And the reason for this is because she was reacting to carbohydrate. It was more of the quantity rather than the quality. The quality was already pretty good. So I checked certain genes, certain SNPs, and through this research and look also blood. So this is one of the ones that was monitoring the glucose level, and it was, considering the age and considering what she was doing and how healthily she was living, it didn't really make much sense. So I thought, okay, look at the genes, and actually we decided to go for a ketogenic. Ketogenic means high fat, not high protein. I still find practitioners that confuse the two. Ketogenic, these are the ratios, so you have about between 5 and 15 of total carbohydrate, total caloric intake. You have between 15 and 25 of protein, depending upon which protein, and 70, and the remaining obviously in fats, healthy fats that is, by the way. So what we started to find are some really interesting trends. So as the person was adapting to the diet, what we started to see were quite interesting changes, and this is perfectly in line with my personal finding. I started experimenting with myself on the n equal 1, and then move up to 5 and 10, and then kept getting larger and larger. So we looked at, for the people that were suitable for this nutritional approach, we had very consistent data in improving life load, exercise, physical activity, improved recovery, and also modulation of inflammation through food, environmental changes, habits, and etc., etc. And interestingly enough, we found that one of the biggest challenges we have as parents, and I'm one of them, is actually children. My heart rate variability during the reading, if my son is stalling before going to bed and, things are not great, is one of the things that still upset me. But anyhow, back to the data. So these are my findings on the research project, and this is an average across 15 individuals. So you can actually see that as the person finished to adapt, I started to do pre-adaptation. I removed the adaptation period and I started to track post-adaptation period. So trying to have a like for like. And many of the studies on ketogenic application, on any diet application, they're not long enough, or they don't allow the body to make substantial adaptations. And that, I think, is a massive mistake in the architecture of the study. So first of all, we started to see that the glucose was starting to go down. But more importantly, what we did notice is it was less erratic. It was much more, especially toward the end, it was much more balanced, much more linear. And at the same time, we saw the ketones increasing, which is pretty normal. Most people think that they are on a ketogenic diet, but when we measure the ketones in both blood and breath, not urine, not terribly precise, we tend to see some really interesting data, especially going through keto flow, which is an adaptation process. Now, calories. We thought, okay, what would happen if we all go on a slightly hyper caloric diet? So we have the high fat, we have the high calories. Actually, let's see what happens to our triglyceride, what happened to our particle size and number of our cholesterol, LDL, VLDL, and HDL. Actually, the marker went down post-adaptation. So at the same time, we started to notice that most of us will start to drop body fat. This was done on a caliper. It wasn't obviously a CT scan or anything like that. These are the resources that were reasonably practical in order to do our research project. Obviously, the weight went down, but the difference between the two, so the starting point, meant that there was a very, very little, virtually negligible increase in lean mass. But I wouldn't personally take that into account, because I think that just achieving that through subtracting total weight minus the fat loss, I don't think, I would want something a little bit more consistent. It could be water, could be loss of glycogen, it could be all sorts of things that I personally don't want to take, give too much attention. Now, the other very interesting thing is that if you split this in half, right down the middle here, you can see that the workload in green and the training in blue, as you can see from here, were of a certain entity. In the second half here, you can actually see that the training intensity and the number is slightly increased, and the intensity of life load people had was also increased on average, yet the average of the heart rate variability increased. That was one of the first time that this has happened through dietary recommendation, or specific dietary recommendation. This to us is very important, because we look at specific changes that improve our resilience. So people were able to work harder a little bit, longer a little bit, and also train more often. And interestingly enough, the same thing happened for glucose. So as the intensity increases, normally we have a bit more of an increase, normally about 0.6 of a point, or 10 to 12 in the US type of measurement. So if he's mmol, 0.6 is actually quite relevant. And regardless the stress response was going up, the glucose was actually still coming down. So for the people interested about all of these correlation, I have put here a summary chart, so you can download or listen again to the podcast that has been recorded, and you can freeze the screen and have all of the data in relation to heart rate variability, life load, training recovery, and so on. So just to finish and kind of summarize, what were our findings through dietary adaptation to ketogenic diet in suitable individuals using a Firstbeat approach? Well, first of all, potentially strong benefit for endurance, we know that for sure, and performance, as long as it's well done and as long as they have the right metabolism. Potential benefit increasing resilience to life load, so the sum of healthy stress and unhealthy stress, but also, more importantly, I would say, potential increase in recovery and general adaptation. So I also found other correlation. I wasn't looking for these, but they were pretty undeniable. First of all, alcohol for the first 1 to 2 hours is calming and relaxing, whereas after that it becomes I wouldn't say pro-inflammatory, we can't really say that, but definitely there is a sympathetic activation. So it acts on GABA receptors for the first hour or 2 hours, depending upon quantity, but then after that it would reverse that in a synaptic gap. Poor sleep. Everyone virtually was affected by poor sleep. Some people after 1 day, some other people after 2 to 3. Also, injury, post-training muscle soreness, also DOM, whatever you want to call it, and illnesses reduces heart rate variability, and at the same time increases glucose level. Now, caffeine also, if it's good quality, mycotoxin free, and if it's a good quality, let's call it, even in the lack of presence of fat, as long as there are no carbohydrates, did not affect any of the other readings, especially glucose. And this is something we were not taught at college so many times. And also the life load. Life load normally would increase the glucose, but not on what we would say a keto adapted diet, or I should say better, a diet that is tailored to the individuals. And for that, that's the reason why I have used all my toolkit. But the great insight for this adaptation was obviously the Firstbeat, purely because of the nature of the type of measurements that we have. So these are my my contacts. I'm pretty much out and about in the UK and US. But if you have any question, I'm pretty sure we should have, I think, a few minutes, a few questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex. Very interesting presentation and good insights. I would like to remind also the participants that if you did have some questions about a specific slide, like Alex mentioned, you will have the podcast available, and then you will be able to, for example, check the research citation on a specific slide, so we don't have to go back to that right now. And yeah, great points. I particularly enjoyed the term that you use for overtraining under recovery. I think it's very apt and fits in many situations. And really, in the end, in most cases, it is about finding the balance between life load and exercise and the nutrition and recovery, and finding the individual balance for individuals. So a couple of questions here. I will read out. There's one question that came about the experiment that you did for 15 individuals. The question is, what was the duration of the experiment where you did that study with the 15 people?
Sure, Dina. A great question, because I stopped most of the reading. So basically, I left it open, and some people are still going a year later. And the data have now stabilized, and now they're nice and steady. So basically, the changes we have observed, the most prominent were at 3 months and 6 months. And then after that, there is a leveling of the improvements. And I have a few ideas about it, of the reason why, but they're these are just at the moment nothing more than good assumptions, which I prefer to keep for myself. But there are involved mitogenesis, mitochondrial health, NADH pathways, methylation saving, ammonia sparing, nitric oxide, all of these pathways are all involved in that. So when the body uses a preferred form of fuel, can take as little, I know it sounds a lot, but in actual fact is as little as 3 months to fully adapt to a new regime. At 6 months, we were still having some improvements. I am still tracking data in 5 individuals.
Okay, great. Let's take one more question about ketogenesis, and I think there might be a couple of questions and we can answer the rest of them via email, or Alex can answer them via email afterwards. But here's a question. As low carbohydrate diets have overwhelmingly been found to decrease performance in most endurance athletes, which would you say is the right metabolism for an athlete who would benefit from a ketogenic type diet?
How long do we got? Yeah, it is really interesting because the data I pulled out and the way how the study was architectured is exceptionally important, is absolutely essential for the result. And it is a great question, by the way, and thank you for asking that, because I don't have any attachment to any diet. So for me, is whatever is best for the individual. Now, there are certain genetic mutations that, one, raises glucose circulating level. So someone is healthy, middle age, on a healthy diet, exercising, sugar level of 5.5. That to me is not looking good because it's way too high for that lifestyle. In addition to that, people that do not do well on a ketogenic diet, they have specific mutations for fatty acid metabolism, and I'm mapping them out between now and April, where I will present my data at the ShakeOn 2016 from Seeking Health and in the US. And so I'm working on that precisely, but the vast majority, a ketogenic adaptation can take anything between 3 to 6 months. So if someone takes an athlete and try a low carbohydrate diet and they are on a normal diet and then they go on a week of adaptation, the person will feel awful. So I totally agree with that question, and I'm really, really glad that a person asked it. It is absolutely essential that people measure glucose, ketones, if they want lactic acid and lactate, because that will increase, but the Cori cycle seems to also speed up. So the VO2 max threshold seems to be slightly higher. And even when they go in anaerobic, they seem to be able to still burn more fat. The differentiation is between aerobic and anaerobic type of sports, because my small area of research, I have 2 anaerobic, very anaerobic sports, and this is where I found the most of the struggle, but I seem to have cracked it now. And I also got data on that. So to me is, one, architecture of the study. Most of the studies are completely wrong because they're not measuring like for like. They don't measure adaptation. They do measure the adaptation, and adaptation should be a period that should be voided. Once someone is keto adapted fully, beta hydroxybutyrate in the blood, good levels of acetone, can also measure acetoacetate, but not in urine. So once someone is nice and stable, then I would do a comparison like for like. And the one that they did are actually positive studies. So there is a very, very recent one from Keith Grimaldi, Dr. Keith Grimaldi, Assistant Professor Dominic D'Agostino, that just published 3 studies in the last 2 months have come out on long distance athletic performance. So Dr. Peter Attia is doing quite a lot of work on that, or at least did. So lovely, completely unbiased people. Once again, they also don't sell anything. So, you know, they're researchers. So I hope this was an eloquent answer. But look at the study, look at the methodology.
Yeah, thank you very much. And a reminder that, of course, the participants, you are welcome to also contact Alex directly via his email address that's on the last slide here if you have some specific questions. This is all the time that we have for today. So thank you very much, Alessandro, and everyone for taking part in today's webinar. We will have the presentation podcast available on the website later this week. So thanks for joining us, and join us again next time. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having me. Have a good day.